What if I told you that the feeling of being awake is just another layer of sleep? That what you call conscious life is actually just an automatic mode of existence, a sequence of reactions, repetitive thoughts, and inherited interpretations. But there's something within you that remains the same, something silently watching it all unfold. It might be hard to put into words, but if you pay attention right now, you might notice that unmoving point within. It doesn't think, react, or judge. It simply observes. And it's precisely in this silent space that something extraordinary can happen: the awakening of consciousness. This awakening happens in a simple, almost imperceptible way, but it changes everything. Suddenly, you begin to see not only what's happening outside of you, but also what's unfolding inside. And you realize that the state of consciousness in which you live each moment is what truly shapes your reality. You may think you're already awake. After all, you're listening, thinking, living. But what if this is only part of it? What if there's another level that you haven't fully accessed yet? To understand why this matters, we need to start from the only point that never moves: the present moment. It's not always what happens that matters, but how you are when it happens. Two people can go through the same situation, a loss, a criticism, an unexpected event, and respond in completely different ways. One is shaken, the other stays grounded. The difference isn't in the facts, but in the state of consciousness with which each one meets the moment. This is the most overlooked point by most people, believing that the primary factor is the circumstance itself and not the consciousness that perceives it. Many believe that it's the situation that causes their suffering, but the situation is just the stage. What really creates suffering is the unconscious interpretation, the inner resistance, the lack of presence in the face of what arises. We're conditioned to react as if the world controls us, as if power is always external. But in truth, it all begins within. It's the presence, or absence of it, that determines whether we're dealing with reality or just mental reflections of fear, judgment, resistance, or desire. The unconscious state makes us react automatically, as if we're being dragged by an emotional current without knowing how to swim. In that state, experiences are no longer lived as they are. They're distorted by an invisible filter, the filter of a conditioned mind. When you're not conscious, it's the mind that interprets the moment, and it will do so based on the past. In that state, you don't see what is. You see what you believe it is. This is one of the biggest traps of the human mind, mistaking the content of thought for reality. But when there is conscious awareness, something shifts. The experience still happens. The external event still exists, but now it's received by a wider field, a state of attention that doesn't react automatically. This state allows the new to be seen as new, and not as a repetition of the past. This is where presence becomes a turning point. Being present is being whole in the now, without being hijacked by thoughts of the past or projections of the future. It's observing what's in front of you, and also observing what's happening inside you as it unfolds. That space between stimulus and response is where true freedom is born. Because only from conscious perception can you choose not to repeat the ego's automatic patterns, not to identify with a fleeting emotion, not to react, but to act with clarity. Awakening is exactly that, the awakening of a broader perception, one that's present before reaction, before interpretation, before the mental story. It's when you realize that you may not be what you feel or think, but the one who observes, the silent, lucid, attentive observer. And this is something that can be recognized at any moment, even now. So think about this. When something unexpected happens, do you notice the event first or the inner tension it triggers? The answer to that question may reveal more about your level of presence than anything else, because before any real change in life, you need to understand the origin of the experiences you're living, not in the circumstances themselves, but in the internal quality that receives and shapes them. There's a big difference between going through events and getting lost inside them, and that difference is born from the quality of awareness you sustain in the moment when everything happens, because ultimately, it's that quality that shapes the reality you call life. True awareness begins the moment you become capable of observing yourself. One of the most direct ways to break the cycle of mental autopilot is by asking a simple, powerful question. What is my state of consciousness right now? This question doesn't seek a verbal or intellectual answer. It acts as a portal, a gateway to bring your attention back to the here and now. The moment you ask yourself about your presence, the mind slows down, the internal noise begins to quiet, and a silent space opens. You're no longer fully identified with the passing thoughts. You're observing. And in that space of observation, the state of consciousness begins to reveal itself. There are signs that indicate presence. Your breathing becomes more noticeable, your body feels less tense, there's a sense of clarity, as if you've stepped out of a mental fog and returned to the raw reality of the senses. On the other hand, when consciousness is obscured, thoughts seem urgent, time feels tight, and the mind acts like an anxious narrator, interpreting everything nonstop. These contrasts between presence and distraction are noticeable even in the simplest situations. A closer look allows you to see when the mind is at peace and when it's trying to escape. This distinction is essential because many times we believe we are conscious just because we are physically awake. But true presence isn't determined by physical wakefulness. It's determined by the quality of attention. When the mind is constantly projecting the future or chewing on the past, the now becomes invisible, and with it, the only place where life actually happens. That's why this question isn't an intellectual exercise. It's a point of return. It breaks the rhythm of autopilot and repositions us in the present. And through this reflection, you may notice that even without a clear reason, there was tension in your shoulders, a vague anxiety, or a recurring thought trying to solve something that's not even happening. You may realize that your mind was elsewhere, interpreting the now as if it were not enough. But what if the now is exactly what you've been avoiding? What if this constant attempt to be somewhere else is actually the root of much of your inner discomfort? There's a silent restlessness that follows most people, a feeling that the now is never quite enough, and almost imperceptibly, the desire arises to be somewhere else, living something different, being someone better, or feeling something more intense. It's as if the present moment always carried a subtle shadow of dissatisfaction, as if something were wrong or incomplete with what's happening now. This restlessness, as common as it may seem, is not natural. It's the result of an unconscious mental state that's been normalized, a mental flow that constantly projects idealized futures or replays past events trying to extract meaning, control, or comfort. This back and forth between what already happened and what hasn't arrived yet creates a chronic disconnection from the only place where life actually unfolds, the now. And this disconnection, when sustained long enough, becomes the foundation of a subtle and dangerous trap, the reality trap. Projecting yourself forward or backward in time is a form of escape. We run from the feeling of emptiness, from restlessness, from the question of who we are when we're not doing anything. We run from silence because it reveals too much. We run from the present because it offers no guarantees, no control. But paradoxically, it's in that very incomplete seeming present where all wholeness is contained. The more we get used to thinking in terms of when I get this or when that changes, the more we reinforce the idea that this moment is not enough. And the more this idea repeats, the more the emotional system adapts to it, creating a constant sense of lack, as if we're always on the edge of something important, but never truly complete or present where life is. That's the foundation of restlessness, an internal agitation that keeps us moving constantly, even when sitting in silence. A discomfort that doesn't come from the environment, but from the mind. A dissatisfaction that doesn't come from the now, but from resistance to it. So just pause and reflect. How many times today did you find yourself imagining a better scenario than the one you're in? How many times did your mind try to convince you that peace, joy, or fulfillment were just a few steps away, maybe in another person, another place, another version of yourself? That impulse isn't occasional. It's triggered, especially in moments when something seems promising. Like when you believe you finally found what was missing, that now it's going to work out, that this person or experience might finally fill the space that felt empty until now. Behind many human desires, there's a silent promise. When I have this, I'll be complete. That promise takes many forms: the perfect relationship, professional success, the dream house, long-awaited recognition. And for a moment, it seems legitimate. After all, when something we deeply desire finally happens, we feel a surge of energy, a kind of quiet euphoria, as if we've reached something sacred. That's what many call fulfillment, but what few realize is that this moment is not wholeness. It's just temporary relief from the desire. The mind interprets that sensation as fulfillment, as if it finally found what it was looking for. But it doesn't last, because what was achieved quickly becomes background, and what seemed like the peak soon turns into routine. That which once felt magical, like a new relationship, a new project, a new version of yourself, loses its shine and dissolves under the weight of routine, repetition, and daily reality. The mind then does what it always does. It projects a new ideal, a new when, a new who, a new where. And then the feeling of searching starts again. This is the cycle of illusion, the idea that there's a perfect moment waiting for you somewhere in time, in a specific situation, in some intense experience that will finally end your inner restlessness. But what this cycle actually reveals isn't a destination. It's the continuation of desire itself. Take, for example, someone who is in love. It's common to see people believing they've found their other half, projecting onto the other all the qualities they want to see in themselves. The initial connection feels magical, but what's really being experienced most of the time isn't the other person in their fullness. It's the reflection of one's own idealizations. And the greater the idealization, the greater the disillusionment when reality sets in. As you get to know the other person, you realize they're not there to complete what's missing in you. They're just being who they are. And that inevitably breaks the spell. This is when many people feel deeply frustrated because they believe they had finally found it. But what they actually found was just another chapter of a projected desire, a desire that, by its very nature, can never be satisfied. So think about it. After you've achieved something you really wanted, how long did it take for the next goal to appear? What seemed like the end of a search suddenly becomes the beginning of a new one. This repetition reinforces the illusion that completeness is always ahead, but never here. That's why so many ancient sages warned about desire as a trap. Not because desire is a problem in itself, but because when taken as a promise of lasting fulfillment, it keeps us spinning in circles, always believing that the next experience will be the one that finally sets us free. The search for truth didn't begin recently. Long before modern explanations, self-help books, and contemporary therapies, there were already individuals waking up to a reality that couldn't be seen with the eyes or explained with words. They weren't interested in collecting more information, but in freeing themselves from illusion. And despite cultural differences, they all pointed in the same direction: awakened consciousness. The word Buddha, for example, isn't a personal name, but a title. It comes from the Sanskrit root Bud, which means to wake up or to be awake. Buddha literally means the one who has awakened, not from ordinary sleep, but from a type of unconsciousness that dominates most of human experience, the state of living without realizing you're alive. The Buddha's awakening wasn't mystical in the popular sense of the word. It was a direct and deep recognition of the nature of the mind and the illusion it constantly builds. A radical cut from identification with the conditioned self and an absolute return to the present moment without resistance. This same essence appears in the teachings of Jesus. Throughout the Gospels, he repeatedly says, "Keep watch," or "Don't fall asleep." And in some passages of the Bible, he wasn't talking about physical wakefulness or resisting bodily sleep. He was referring to spiritual awareness. At every moment, consciousness can be pulled into distractions, emotional reactions, and compulsive thoughts. Jesus knew this, and that's why his invitation was clear and direct: stay awake. In one of his most powerful statements in Mark 13:37, he says, "And what I say to you, I say to all, watch." This passage is universal, so awakening isn't just about accumulated knowledge, it only requires presence. What's most fascinating is that these teachings, born in such different cultures, align perfectly in essence. But both point to the same truth. There is a reality behind the apparent reality, and it can only be seen by those who are truly awake. So when we talk about awakening, we're connecting with a living lineage of wisdom, passed down through generations through symbols, words, and silence. And not by accident, all of them, masters, sages, prophets, used a recurring metaphor: the comparison between physical sleep and spiritual unconsciousness. But after all, what kind of sleep is it that can happen even with your eyes open, in broad daylight? What exactly were these spiritual masters trying to show us with this metaphor? So direct, and yet so often ignored. Being awake doesn't necessarily mean being conscious. Most of humanity lives their days with open eyes, talking, walking, interacting, but functioning in a mental state that's not much different from sleep. That's what many sages call sleepwalking, a way of existing where a person seems present but is actually completely immersed in automatic thoughts, conditioned emotions, and repetitive mental patterns that go unquestioned. This state is fueled by a conditioned mind shaped by years of experiences, beliefs, traumas, lessons, and memories. The conditioned mind doesn't see reality as it is. It sees what it has learned to see. It doesn't respond consciously. It reacts based on programming. And that's exactly why it's possible to go through years, even an entire life, without truly being awake at any moment. There's a huge difference between neurological wakefulness and true awakened consciousness. In the first case, you're standing, talking, working, doing everything expected of a functioning person. In the second, you are fully aware of what you're doing, feeling, and thinking. You're not being dragged by the mental current. You are aware of the current. The difference between the two states isn't in outer behavior, but in the quality of inner perception. Most people don't live in the present. They live in memories or projections. What they call life is actually a constant loop between what's already happened and what hasn't happened yet. Thoughts about the past feed regret or nostalgia. Thoughts about the future bring anxiety, expectations, fear. And in this continuous flow of psychological time, the now disappears. The direct experience of life becomes thin, almost non-existent. The body is here, but the attention is elsewhere. That is the core of unconsciousness, when you're so identified with the stream of thoughts that you don't realize you're thinking. The mind takes over, and your being moves to the background, like a forgotten, silent witness. You don't live, you're being lived. You don't think, you're being thought. Think about that. Do you lead your thoughts, or do you notice they lead you? This is one of the most revealing questions you can ask yourself, because it points directly to the fact that there is something in you that can observe the mind, something that is not the mind itself. And as long as that observer is not recognized, your experience of life remains limited, mechanical, and predictable, with no real space for transformation. But there is a silent point inside all of us that never got lost in that process, a presence that watches without interfering, without judging, without needing to understand, a consciousness that is not stuck in the past or anxious for the future. And it's exactly this space that gives us the key to exit psychological sleep, because identifying sleep is just the first step. The real awakening begins when we recognize who's observing all this. Who is this presence that never sleeps? At the center of the human experience, there is something that doesn't change, a silent, unmoving point that isn't altered by emotions, contaminated by thoughts, or involved in stories. It only observes. And even when you're in conflict, confused, or emotionally overwhelmed, that point is still there, stable, untouched, silent. This is the dimension of consciousness, what many call pure consciousness, or the inner witness, the part of you that never sleeps, never reacts, only witnesses. This distinction between what changes and what observes is one of the most important someone can make on the path to awakening, because the mind is always in motion. It creates ideas, images, memories, interpretations, and internal voices like a play that never ends. But all of that happens inside something that doesn't take part in the drama, but allows it to happen. And when you begin to notice the difference between the content and the space in which the content appears, something profound shifts inside. For most of life, people believe they are what they think. They say things like, "I am anxious," "I am insecure," "I am this or that," without realizing they are confusing temporary states with a permanent identity. But when there's a recognition that these states come and go, and that there is a consciousness that witnesses them, a freedom arises that once seemed unreachable. Because now you are no longer the role you play, nor the character with all their pain and victories. You are the space in which all of that happens. That space is your deepest identity. It's not defined by memory or past experiences. It doesn't need to be defended or affirmed. It simply is. And that's why it holds unshakable peace, because it's not tied to time, story, or the need for approval. This witnessing consciousness is what remains when everything else changes. Who notices your own mental voice in this moment? Who is that one who sees the thoughts without needing to follow them? Who observes the anger without being overtaken by it? Who feels the sadness and still remains present? That's where true transformation begins. Because while the mind is always trying to fix, prove, or control, the observer seeks nothing. It simply sees. And that seeing is the awakening itself. Consciousness isn't something you have. It's what you are. Even before any thought appears, it's already present, silent, witnessing everything. And in that space of pure observation, where there's no judgment or effort, you realize the observer and the observed are not separate. Thought only exists because something is conscious of it. Emotion is only felt because there's a field that perceives it. This is the point where the so-called observer effect, known in quantum physics, meets its inner version. The simple presence of consciousness changes the way reality is experienced. And more than that, the observer is you. Not the you made up of stories and memories, but the real you who doesn't change with the roles you play. When presence is total, the separation between who observes and what is observed begins to disappear. You start to understand, not conceptually, but experientially, that what is seen is also an expression of the very consciousness that sees. This is when it becomes clear, in silence, that the observer is the observed, and all that remains is the quiet clarity of being fully present, whole, awake. And slowly, this perception begins to stabilize. You no longer get lost so easily in mental noise. What once seemed urgent now becomes just another thought that rises and falls. What once was a problem to fix now becomes just an experience to observe. That's when life starts to reveal itself in a different light, no longer as a sequence of obstacles to overcome, but as a real space where presence can unfold in a vivid and silent way. So awakening isn't a finish line. It's not a moment of ecstasy you reach once and then stay in by default. True spiritual awakening marks, in fact, the beginning of a new way of relating to everything, to yourself, to others, to life, and to time. It doesn't promise the absence of difficulty, but it reveals a new way to move through it, with presence, awareness, and less identification with what isn't essential. Living awake in a sleeping world requires a kind of constant attention, not a mental rigidity, but a soft, lucid presence that stays with you even while you play roles, meet obligations, or handle unexpected situations. And this becomes even more challenging in a world where external noise never stops, where social media stimulates reactivity, where information overload fragments focus, where the speed of stimuli shuts down inner listening. Being present in the middle of all this isn't easy, but it's possible, and that's exactly why it's so valuable. Living in the now doesn't mean abandoning practical life. It means living it with more depth. It means being fully present in what you do, without mentally being in 3 places at once. It means becoming aware of thought the moment it arises. It means noticing the emotion before it becomes impulsive action. It means bringing clarity where there was only unconscious repetition. This kind of conscious life doesn't depend on external circumstances. It's born from the quiet commitment not to fall asleep again, even if everything around you seems to be operating on autopilot. It's about becoming a point of balance, a kind of presence that, by itself, already communicates something different, without needing to say a word. What would your day be like if every action came from that place of clarity? What if before reacting you just took a breath? What if before judging you just observed? What if before defending yourself you recognize what you're trying to protect? That's the kind of presence we're talking about. That level of presence can completely transform the way you experience each small moment of life. And this transformation doesn't require grand gestures. It starts with small pauses. In the moments when you choose to be conscious instead of reactive, when you feel, almost imperceptibly, that there is another way to live, one that doesn't try to escape the now, but inhabits it with honesty and sincerity. Maybe then the most powerful change isn't trying to transform the world out there, but transforming the way the world is seen, felt, and lived in every now. Because when perception changes, everything changes with it. Without effort, without speech, without the need for control, just with presence. Thank you for embarking on this journey with me. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others so they can benefit from this message. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, reflections, and experiences. Thanks again for watching and for joining me. Take care and see you soon.